Socks. The often overlooked and neglected little sibling of the family of clothing. They valiantly risk their lives day by day to protect your little piggies from the outside world. And how do we repay them? By confining them to a dark drawer for the majority of their lives, being worn without a shred of respect for their well-being, only to be replaced by the next brave soul in line when they grow too old to be of use to us. But has it ever crossed your mind how these peculiar little creations came to be? Well, make yourself comfortable, and let me tell you a story. The story of socks. Socks were first used by the ancient Greeks around the 8th century BC. According to this guy, these early socks were called pilou, which means clay in Greek, but they were made of matted animal hair, so I don't really know what the Greeks were on when they thought of that. Oh, I guess that's what it was. If we jump ahead in time a little bit, I can actually show you an example of these early socks. Look, this is actually the earliest surviving example of a sock that we have available. This sock originated in ancient Egypt around 300 to 500 AD and is one of the most important relics in all of dad culture. If you look very closely here, you can actually see that there is a gap between the toes. That's because this sock was designed for tactical use with sandals. As time continued, socks continued to evolve and increase in significance, with many different types of socks being worn with many different meanings. One example of this was puttees, which were worn in the 5th century by holy people to show off just how holy they were. As evolution progressed, people started to wear shorter and shorter breeches, but to remain, holy, socks increased in length to cover any shown skin. But there was one major issue with this. Socks were still being handmade at this point, which meant that it eventually got really expensive to make these long socks. The ridiculous prices of socks at this time led to them mostly being a symbol of wealth from around 1000 AD up until 1589. These were very, very dark times for the sock industry. But when there was no hope left for the common man who simply wanted his little footsies to be comfy, a tiny light appeared at the end of the tunnel. A tiny light in the form of a man. It's 1563. A young lad of the name William Lee was born in the village of Calverton, Nottinghamshire. He lived an ordinary life, attending school at Christ's College and St. John's College. One day, after a long day of classes, he was out and about trying to court one specific lady. Well, as it turns out, this particular lady really liked knitting. Really liked knitting. To the point where she apparently paid more attention to knitting than she did to him. So you know what he did? This chivalrous young man just went out and created an entire machine to do the job just for her. This machine was capable of knitting socks up to 6 times faster than an average hand knitter was capable of. Yes, this thing had the power of 6 grandmas. He knew he had something revolutionary at his hands, so he approached the queen in search of a patent. He presented the queen with a pair of stockings to prove the excellence and utility of this revolutionary device. There was no way she could turn down a machine like this. A machine that had the potential to change the entire world as we know it. And she said no. Apparently, the stockings were too coarse for royal ankles. So he went back to his workshop. He worked tirelessly to remake his creation to accommodate the finest of textures and materials. And finally, he had stockings of the best quality possible. There was no way she would turn him down this time. These socks were absolutely perfect, made with the finest materials available, the most intricate of patterns. Hell, these things even had their own air conditioning and heating. And, well, she apparently cared about the job security of her hand knitters. So poor little William was left in despair. Willie was fed up with this, and he needed the world to have more affordable socks. He entered a partnership with a man named George Brooke, and finally everything was set up for these two to make an absolute fortune. Aside from the fact that George was arrested on counts of treason and then executed a few years later in 1603. Well, poor little William was lost at this point once again. There was no light at the end of the tunnel for him. No reason left to live, so he did what only the most desperate of men would even ever attempt to do. He moved to France. So with him, he took his knitting machine and his brother, and he tried to approach the leader of these new lands. Well, good old Henry IV. Henry the Great, you know, Big H. He was a man who understood the significance of cheap socks. So he signed a patent over to William. Now everything was going great, and William was finally prospering. After so long, it all had paid off. He was starting to provide socks to the masses and making absolute bank whilst doing so. So that's the story of the man who brought affordable socks to the people. Wait, what do you mean there's more? Okay, fine. Everything wasn't fine. Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, and even though William had the patents and everything, he was ignored by the new rulers and he died a sad death in 1614. His brother moved back to England after his death and established some knitting centers or something, I don't know, and that's how socks really became more widely available to the people once again. There. That's the story of Willie. Now after this point, the history of socks gets a little lamer. Some people made better sock machines, and some others found better materials to make socks out of. Oh yeah, and at one point, some tiny-ass town in Alabama was the sock capital of the world. And that's it. That's pretty much the entire history of socks, I think. That's as much as I cared to learn about anyway. Bye-bye.